Hey guys, it's been a while, but I'm back again, this time with a video for you covering the Steamdeck by Valve. So while I used to be almost exclusively a console gamer, over the last few years I've definitely found myself gravitating more and more towards PC games. So when it released, the Steam Deck was something that jumped out at me as a really interesting idea that combined the best of both worlds. I was a little bit skeptical upon release, knowing Valve's track record with different products in the past, but when it went on sale for their 1-year anniversary, I decided to give it a try. I've been using the Steam Deck almost daily for about 2.5 months now, and I figured it was finally time to put out a review on it. So in this video, we're going to cover the hardware, the software, the games, and at the end I'll also go over the Steam Deck dock accessory in case that's also something you're interested in. So for reference, I've never really been a handheld guy before the last couple of years. I owned a Game Boy Pocket as a kid, a Game Boy Advance SP for a little while, and then very briefly a DS. But generally speaking, a dedicated console has always been more my style. The first handheld that I ever picked up that got a ton of use was actually my Nintendo Switch. There's going to be a lot of comparisons between the Steam Deck and the Switch in this video, just because that's my main point of reference for this kind of thing, and they are kind of similar devices. So in terms of comparing this to how a PC runs, I have a pretty decent computer. I run all my games at 1440p with max graphics. That's also my point of reference. Okay, so first impressions when it comes to the Steam Deck. When you go to unbox it, there's not really a whole lot going on. So it arrives in a plain cardboard box, and everything else inside of it is also in very plain packaging. Now, this isn't really a big deal. I mean, you're buying the console, not the box. But when you compare it to the pretty cool unboxing of an Xbox Series X, or even the serviceable unboxing of like a PlayStation 5 or a Nintendo Switch, in a world where all the major console makers do put a lot of effort into this, it definitely stood out, and it didn't get me hyped to play with the Steam Deck right away. If nothing else, I'd love to see the specs of this machine listed on the packaging somewhere instead of having to Google it. So the handheld itself is 11.7 inches long by 4.6 inches wide and about 1.9 inches thick. Now, to compare this to the Nintendo Switch is 9.4 inches long, 4 inches high, and about half an inch thick. When you have them side by side, you can really see the difference between them, and even if it isn't actually that much bigger, the screen on the Steam Deck feels a lot larger than the screen on a Switch. But it is important to note that the Steam Deck is fairly heavy, especially if you compare it to something like the Switch. Well, obviously it's not going to break your wrist to hold this thing. It might be on the far edge of comfortable for some people. And unlike the Switch, it doesn't have a kickstand built into it, and it definitely doesn't stand up on its own, so this thing is intended to always be held. The build quality of it feels really good. Like, it feels rugged, it feels sturdy, it doesn't feel like something that's going to break if I accidentally drop it. I also really like the contours and the shape of it, and generally speaking, I found it pretty comfortable to hold. The screen is a diagonal 7 inches wide, and the resolution is 1280 by 800, so pretty much 720p. Something to keep in mind is that this resolution of 1200 by 800, not every game you play is going to support it, especially a lot of the older games you can get on Steam. So in a lot of these games, there's actually going to be black bars at the top and bottom of the image. Now, some games are able to adapt to the Steam Deck's resolution, but if not, it's going to be the default standard 720p just with those bars. And in a handheld of this size, 720p is fine. It definitely doesn't look amazing, but it looks okay, and generally speaking, I never found myself getting dragged down by the visuals. The screen itself looks pretty sharp when you play it, especially on the menus. The refresh rate of the screen is 60 Hz, which is a little bit disappointing because I was hoping to maybe get games that would run at over 100 frames per second, but obviously the resolution and also that max frame rate are one of the reasons that they're able to get such powerful games to run on this thing fairly seamlessly. It is also a touchscreen, which may or may not come into play depending on the game. I found myself using the touchscreen a lot more than I was expecting to. The touchscreen works especially well on the menus, and also there is a virtual keyboard that you can pull up at any time, and it is much easier to use the touchscreen to type on the keyboard than to navigate using the joystick on your controller. The hard drive inside of the Steam Deck is customizable depending on which model you buy. The one I'm reviewing here has the 256GB hard drive, as that was the price point that I was comfortable with, and also I was planning on using an SD card to hold a lot of my games, which is something you can do. The face buttons on the console all feel fine, same with the shoulder bumpers and triggers. The joysticks I quite like. They have a nice textured edge, and I found they were very responsive during fast-paced games, and the texture on the joysticks themselves made it so that I didn't slip while playing. Now, there's also a variety of face buttons on the Steam Deck, like this one here that opens the Steam menu, this one over here for quick access, and 4 customizable buttons on the back. Now, this is similar to what several Pro controllers and whatnot do, having these extra buttons, and you can map them to various functions on a per game basis, which is kind of cool. I didn't find I used them that often, but they are there. There's also 2 trackpads under the joysticks for instances where you absolutely have to use a mouse. And while they worked okay, this is one of the things that I dislike the most about the Steam Deck. They're very sensitive, very imprecise because of how small the trackpad is, and they're just kind of clunky to use. Any situation where I was able to use the touch screen instead of these trackpads, I always went for that. And anyone who has ever tried to do any real gaming using a laptop trackpad can attest to the fact that even with a full-size trackpad, it's far from ideal. These are basically a slightly worse version of that. And there were definitely games where I tried to use it and it was pretty much unplayable. The speakers on the Steam Deck sound fine. You can also hook up headphones using the jack up here or pair a set of Bluetooth ones. And the console can also output audio via HDMI when it's connected to the dock or a USB hub. And while that usually worked okay, I did run into some issues where I would have to manually select which device to play audio from for it to work. There's also a couple of games where the audio just would not play through HDMI no matter what I did, and only through the speakers on the device itself. I don't know if that's specific to the game or if there's something else I could have done, but at a certain point I just got tired of trying to make it work. Now this thing has a pretty beefy battery. It's listed at 2 to 8 hours of gameplay, and I feel like that's pretty accurate. Now the more resource intensive your game, the less life you're going to get out of that battery. You can do the usual stuff like lowering or turning off the audio and dimming the screen to conserve power if you want to do that. It can also be played while charging, of course. I will say that generally speaking, for most 3D games, I probably got around the 3 to 4 hour mark of battery life out of it, while some much less intense games like the ones I'm showing here, I definitely did get closer to the 6 to 7 hour mark. So then, how about the software of the Steam Deck itself? When you first get the Steam Deck, it's going to prompt you to configure the Wi-Fi and then download the latest updates, after which point you'll be asked to log into Steam. This entire process took less than 5 minutes for me and it was pretty smooth. Once you log in, you're shown a quick tutorial about the basic functions of your Steam Deck and then you're good to go. The menu and UI takes a little bit of getting used to, but overall it's pretty intuitive and I honestly prefer it over actual Steam for the most part. It always felt very snappy and relatively clean without a lot of screen clutter, which I really appreciate. Navigating with the joystick works great, but you can also swipe through with the touchscreen. There are a lot of settings that you can tweak on this thing, and I'm not going to go super in depth about them in this video. There's a lot you can do in here to make it more tailored to you and the experience you want. Now there is also a desktop mode where it can be used more like an actual computer, and this is what actually allows you to install other game launchers, emulation, different programs, all kinds of stuff like that. And after some initial setup, most of these things you can actually get to launch from the Steam Deck itself in gaming mode. I was expecting to have to hack this thing to be able to play games from other launchers or to do any emulators or anything like that, but overall it's pretty much all been planned for and figured out at this point, and it's turned into a very smooth experience. Desktop mode itself I found a little bit frustrating to use. You can use a USB hub or the dock to hook up like an external keyboard, or you can try and pair a Bluetooth mouse. Just on its own, it's not an ideal experience. If you're going to be using desktop mode for any extended periods of time, I definitely do recommend using a keyboard and mouse if possible. Now, some of the key features that Steam is known for, like free online gaming or remote play, they all still work without too much of a hassle, whether you're joining a game or hosting one. I didn't experience any excess amounts of lag when playing any of my games online, even though the deck in handheld mode is Wi-Fi only. It's not hooked up by Ethernet like my actual computer. I will say that the notifications that appear while in game or on menus, they could use a little bit of work. I kept tweaking the settings over and over to try and get something that worked for me, but it never quite got there. Especially when it came to getting invites to join other people's games, they just never showed up the way I needed them to. I would have to go into a menu after I know somebody had sent me an invite and find it through there. Maybe I just didn't find the right settings to get it to work how I want, but I did find that a little bit annoying. Now you can also engage an overlay that will give you info on the Steam Deck, such as the battery life, performance, all that, and this can be pretty handy and you can actually tailor how in-depth it goes into. Generally speaking, I didn't leave this on because I found it more of a novelty, but I know a lot of people really like this kind of thing. Okay, so now that we've covered the hardware and the software that powers it, let's finally get on to the games, because that's what you're here for, right? What can you play using the Steam Deck? So first of all, we're going to look at official Steam games, and this lets me highlight something that is legitimately my favorite feature about the Steam Deck: compatibility. If you have a game in your library, when you hover over it, it has a little symbol in the bottom right corner. So a green icon like this means that the game is 100% playable and compatible with the Steam Deck. These are all games that have been certified to run properly without issues. As of right now, when I'm recording this video, there's 4,147 games that are verified to work on deck, and there's another 7,481 that are considered playable, and we'll talk about what that means in a second here. And for being less than 2 years in, in on a console that nobody was expecting, that's a pretty good number. And there are more and more games that are being added and verified all the time. A lot of older games just haven't gotten looked at yet, so there's just no data on them. And I really appreciate that Steam lets you sort the games by compatibility in the Steam store when you're using the Steam Deck. So a yellow icon means that the game will run, but you might have a few hiccups. When you go to actually install it, it will list these out for you. For example, menus might require you to use the mouse or need to use the on-screen keyboard to type certain things in, or maybe the text is very small, stuff like that. Now, I love that they actually list out what the issues are when the game has a yellow icon, and even after you install it, you can go to the game page and look at these after. This lets you know right away what to watch out for when you play it, and generally speaking, most of the games with the yellow icon ran fine for me, as long as I kept in mind these things that it was talking about. Although, of course, depending on what games you play, your mileage is obviously going to vary. This is just my experience with the games I had. Now, there's also this icon, which means the game is not playable on the deck. Now, whether this is because it's exclusively designed for the keyboard and mouse, or maybe there's just too many keybinds, these are games that are not going to run at all. Now, the final symbol is also this gray icon with a question mark. So these are games that Steam hasn't gotten around to verifying yet and doesn't have enough information on them to make a judgment call over whether or not they'll actually work. Now, I only had a few of these in my library, but these are essentially complete gambles because you don't know what you're going to get. You can still install them, but you have no information on how well it's going to work. Now, I will say from my experience and from what I've seen online, generally speaking, if the game is controller compatible, you're probably going to be fine. If it has partial controller support, it can kind of go either way. And if it doesn't have controller support, who knows? Now, overall, I had pretty good luck with this. I think there was only one game I had that I couldn't get to work at all. But again, with thousands and thousands of games out there, your mileage is definitely going to vary. Now, performance-wise, for me, the games ran fine. The only ones where I really saw any hiccups were games that were not verified and were just marked as playable. Having the games capped at basically 720p 60 FPS means that they all ran pretty well in handheld mode. Now, you can force a higher resolution when using the dock or using a USB hub, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But in handheld mode, for the most part, they ran well. The only hiccups I saw with verified games was when I had games installed on my SD card. Then occasionally I would see a stutter, but moving them to the internal hard drive seemed to have fixed that. You can also install game mods and run them without any special issues, which was pretty cool. One of the great things about PC games is that you can mod them, so I'm glad you don't lose that functionality here. And most modern games, I was able to hop between my Steam Deck and my actual computer. But something important to keep in mind is that not all Steam games have cloud saves, especially the older ones. So your save game files may or may not be there, and you might not be able to hop between different systems with it. Now, I never ran into any issues with glitches that weren't present in the normal version of the game, and the controls for the games usually felt smooth and worked without issue. In fact, there are some games like Human Fall Flat that I found actually worked better running on the Steam Deck than it did running off my computer with a controller, which is pretty interesting. Games with native controller support obviously ran the best, but even the ones where I occasionally would need to use the on-screen keyboard or whatnot still didn't cause any problems or really affect my enjoyment or experience. And considering how many games there are on Steam, with the vast majority having been released before the Steam Deck even existed as a concept, I'm overall pretty happy with how well most games run on it. And hopefully popular games that don't run well on it will get updated so that they do in the future. There were also a lot of games that ran really well using the touchscreen, reminding me of playing a lot of games on my iPad in a good way. In fact, I did a comparison test of Plants vs. Zombies, which I had recently played through on my tablet. It did make me realize that the touchscreen on the Steam Deck is not as fluid and responsive as something on like a tablet or your phone. Oftentimes where you end up pressing or clicking when you use the touchscreen is slightly below and to the right of where you would expect it to be, and you need to kind of adjust and account for that. Still though, several games ran great on it, making them almost feel like mobile games, and I'm not much of a mobile gamer, but honestly, it worked. So then what about non-Steam games? Say I tried to load up a game with the Epic launcher or from GOG. Unfortunately here the results are a lot less promising, but again this isn't stuff that's like officially supported on the Steam Deck, so you can't really be that surprised. While you can get some games to run, there's zero information on their compatibility levels in Steam itself, so it's all basically guesswork. The easiest way is to download the Heroic launcher while in desktop mode and install them using that. So I was able to get a lot of modern games from the Epic store to run, but there were some exceptions. For GOG, I mainly own old PC games, and I wasn't expecting a lot from it, but most of them did not work whatsoever. Getting them to even boot up meant endless tweaking of the different settings, and in the end, only a couple of them let me even make it to the title screen. And only one of them was even close to playable, and that was Roller Coaster Tycoon. More modern games from GOG probably run fine, but these older ones struggled a lot, and that's mainly what I use GOG for personally. Also important to keep in mind, at least at this point when I'm recording the video, games from other launchers have to be installed on the internal hard drive, and you can't run them off the SD card. So the moral of the story when it comes to games from other launchers is that while you can get some of them to run, don't count on any of them working smoothly without a lot of tweaks if they run at all, and even then there's no guarantees. Something that ran surprisingly well though was actually emulation on the Steam Deck. Now I will throw this out here right at the top, I'm not really the target audience for emulation. I prefer playing games on original hardware whenever possible, but I know that this is something that a lot of people are excited about and a lot of people do, so I did want to cover it at least a little bit. So again, to install these emulators and whatnot, you do have to go through desktop mode, but there is a dedicated app that you can download to streamline the process, and overall it wasn't too bad. It can get a little bit complicated, so if you're new to it, I definitely recommend watching a YouTube tutorial. I'll link the one that I used in the description down below. Once I had everything set up though, it honestly ran pretty well. Even some more modern games ran without a hitch, and I was overall pretty impressed. Now again, I'm not exactly the target audience for emulators, but if this is something that you're interested in, the Steam Deck can definitely do it, and a lot of people speak very highly about the emulation capabilities of this machine. Before I give my final thoughts on this thing, I'm going to cover the Steam Deck dock, which is a totally optional accessory that you can buy. So the dock is very similar to the Nintendo Switch dock. The charging cable for the dock comes out over the top and plugs in here on the top of the deck. The dock has both a DisplayPort and HDMI video out, as well as power in, Ethernet in, and 3 USB ports. Now the 3 USB ports allow you to connect a controller, a keyboard, a mouse, a USB drive, anything like that. Pretty much let you use the Steam Deck as a normal, although pretty limited computer. While the Steam Deck is hooked up to the dock, you can still use it as a controller for playing your games, and personally I found this pretty awkward to do, just FYI. It is also worth noting here that the deck itself did have a lot of problems detecting my wireless controllers. The Steam Deck just could not recognize some of them, forcing me to use them in wired mode. I looked at a lot of YouTube video tutorials for guides on how to fix this problem, and still to this day I can't get my two main controllers to pair to it. However, any controller that I've hooked up wired has worked without issue. So if you connect an external display to the dock for the video out, you can actually raise the resolution of the display up to 4K, but the deck itself is very clearly optimized for the 720p 60 FPS experience. Some games will definitely start to stutter, drop frames, and have issues, and the Steam Deck fans tend to go into overdrive immediately. 1080p didn't really seem to cause any issues for me, but higher than that, and I definitely could hear those fans working. Also, something that's really important to note is that when you're running a game with video out through the dock, it's still going to default to running at that 720p resolution unless you go to the game settings and adjust the resolution. You need to do this for every single game, and it's really easy to forget, which made me wonder several times why my games look so horrible. Again, just a small nitpick, but definitely something to keep in mind. If you use video out for your Steam Deck and it looks terrible, this is probably the cause. And while the dock itself is a fun addition, it definitely doesn't feel overly necessary to me, even as somebody who records footage for videos. The fact that you can use similar USB-C hubs that are cheaper means I probably wouldn't recommend the dock. So then, to wrap up here, what do I think of the Steam Deck itself in the end? Honestly, I really enjoy it. For the times where I want to just kick back on my couch and play some of these games, or if I'm traveling on a plane or in a bus or in an Uber, this thing is amazing. Now, I do think it's really important to know what the limitations of the Steam Deck are and what it can and cannot do going into it. But overall, I think it's a pretty solid device. It could even work as a stepping stone to get people who don't really do PC gaming to get into PC gaming. It's definitely not perfect, but for what it is, it's very solid. Now, there are other companies that are making portable handheld PCs along the same lines as the Steam Deck, but none of them have really been able to match this level of quality at this price point. And the specialized Steam Deck OS with all of its features really help elevate this thing above any of the competition I've yet to see. And again, the price point on this thing is very good. I definitely don't regret this purchase at all. And I will definitely say that all of the community support for this thing, even a year in, all the third-party apps, like for the emulators, for the other game launchers, all the different tutorials and guides on how to do all this different stuff. There are so many people in the community making sure that the Steam Deck is as good as it can possibly be, and that's just awesome. So So yeah, guys, that pretty much wraps up the video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And if you were on the fence about the Steam Deck, I hope that this video helped you decide one way or the other. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really appreciate it. I promise it won't be as long of a break between this video and the next one. I should have another video coming out in the next few months or so. And yeah, I'm just going to call it there. I will see all of you in the next video. Take care, everyone.